Good morning, everyone, and welcome to what promises to be a very timely discussion on what's next for US, China, and the world. Now, contestation has long featured in the US China relationship, and in the last decade, tensions have undeniably been trending up. What we see now is that this strategic competition between US and China has been particularly turbocharged in the last 10 months, bringing about heightened global uncertainty, but also presenting opportunities for recalibration. The choices made by the two powers in the coming months, particularly in the areas of trade, technology, and defense alliances, will definitely reshape global economic balance, reconfigure supply chains, and redefine international security. So, as we look to what's next, I believe many of us actually have our eyes set on the upcoming APEC summit, where President Trump and President Xi Jinping are expected to meet in Korea later this month. So, this highly anticipated meeting provides an opportunity for us to observe how the relationship between these two powers is going to evolve. So, I'm very delighted today to have Ms. Cutler, Professor Wu, and Mr. Mir Puri here with us. The three of them are really like the perfect picks to actually discuss this topic. Ms. Cutler, she brings nearly 3 decades of experience as a US diplomat and trade negotiator. Notably, she served as the acting deputy US trade representative, and she has led many of the bilateral and multilateral negotiations across the Asia Pacific region. Professor Wu is a highly respected academic and prolific author as well. He has published extensively in journals, both in China as well as in the West, and he has written numerous books on Sino-US relations. As for Mr. Mir Puri, before joining Temasek, he has served over a decade as Singapore's ambassador to the United States, and his distinguished career includes ambassadorship in Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as Australia. I'm very excited to hear from the three of you your analysis and predictions for the upcoming meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping. Now, there have been 4 rounds of trade talks between the US and China, but a long-term agreement still remains pretty elusive to me. So there has been broad agreement on the future of TikTok, as well as delaying, extending the trade tariff truce till November. But other than that, we do not know much about what has been discussed or negotiated between these two countries. So on a scale of 0 to 10, I will ask you to tell me how optimistic are you that there will be a substantive trade agreement that will emerge from this meeting in Korea later this month. Now 10, if you believe it is very substantive, as what the US Treasury Secretary Mr. Besson has suggested, and 0 if you think it is just rhetoric. So just a quick score from each of you.
Okay, so you want a number? But
Yes, a number.
I'm going to give you a lot of words. Okay, so my view is I think that the two presidents will have a productive meeting, but I think the prospects of announcing some substantial trade agreement are pretty limited. And this is for a number of reasons. A lot has to do with the nature of the issues that are in front of each country and the ability of each country to move towards the other. And I think that both sides have pretty modest expectations about being able to get the other side to move. And so my view is we'll probably see some positive announcements. Maybe they'll announce the finalization of the TikTok agreement. Maybe they'll announce extending the 90-day tariff pause. Maybe China will announce some new purchases of soybeans or planes. But I think we're going to see, again, a series of isolated announcements, but not a real trade agreement.
What about Professor Wu?
Well, I will go for 8 to 9.
That is very optimistic.
I'm quite optimistic. Well, I think both sides want to see some major agreements in the forthcoming meeting between two leaders. For President Donald Trump, I mean, he always has his priorities in negotiation with China. First was the rare earth supply, and then TikTok, And now as the harvest season is approaching in the US, he would like to see China to purchase more US soybeans, among other US agricultural products, which is very important to his political base in the Midwest. On the Chinese side, uh, we played somewhat different game in the second Trump administration. So after the earlier fight and talk, now it's time to deliver some concrete um, achievements in negotiation with the U.S. Actually, the recent round of negotiation between two sides held in Madrid, I think it was, to some extent, very hopeful for achieving further progress in the next 1 month or so. And in the recent phone conversation between two leaders, President Xi basically said the recent round of negotiation reflected the spirit of equality, respect, and mutual benefit. And we should continue to work on the salient issues on bilateral agenda and hopefully to achieve a win-win outcome. So President Xi sounded quite satisfactory with the very recent round of negotiation. And also, he mentioned particularly three issues in the phone conversation. One is the U.S. unilateral tariff, which should be removed. Second is the deal on TikTok. Basically, it's already there. Third is that the U.S. should work as it promised to improve the environment for Chinese investment in the U.S. So I think that's what we are going to see to be on the agenda when two leaders meet, and hopefully, the agreements will come out of those issues and among other issues. So that's why I'm quite optimistic at the
Will you
moment.
be able to maybe elaborate a little bit when you talk about, improving the investment environment for Chinese companies in US? So what might possibly be suggestions or how they are going to work that out?
The very first progress we want to see when two leaders meet is to fix the tariff issue. You cannot say after the meeting they agree, we're going to postpone this for another 90 days. That's not a good deal, right? The business community, they hate uncertainty. So now it's about, let's say, 54%. So hopefully the 20% related to the drug issue, fentanyl issue, can be removed. Basically, the deal is on table for two leaders to decide. And then you have to think about for the rest, 34%. And should we live with it, or we can further draw down this tariff rate in their negotiation, in the final round of negotiation to be had this month before two leaders meet. We have one more round of negotiation. So that's about tariff. I think that's the very first indicator we look into. And then for the U.S. to improve the environment for Chinese investment in the U.S. When the U.S. asked for China to approve, Chinese government to approve the TikTok deal, basically, TikTok is Chinese investment in the U.S. So if you want to make a deal on this particular issue, you also are obliged to deal with the broad issues confronting the Chinese investment in the U.S. Many Chinese enterprises have encountered all kinds of obstacles in the U.S. as they, pursue their business in the United States. I think the U.S., in the recent round of negotiation, promised to address some of the concern of Chinese enterprises. Now we urge the U.S. to honor its commitment. So hopefully, by the time one two leaders meet, there will be some concrete progress on the specific cases that we brought about in the recent negotiation in Madrid. So that's another area of progress that can be expected.
What about Mr. Mirpuri?
Well, thank you. I think that we need to get beyond the media headlines of outcomes at each individual meeting, more challenging in the US-China relationship. And I am sort of in between Wendy and Professor Wu about what's going to come out, I think we need to look at what is going to endure in terms of that, whatever they come up with. Watching the first Trump term dealing with China, they came out with a deal, but that didn't really endure that long. I think enduring it is far more critical for all of us rather than just having a significant headline that tariffs are off, they've signed a deal, and we need to see what the steps are. In this case, relative to all the other meetings that President Trump has had in the course of his return to office this year, many seem to be done quite quickly. Some don't not seem to have full preparation. The US China relationship has had a whole significant series of preparation. The Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce have met their counterparts several times over the past few months at various European capitals. There has been no real rush to strike a deal. Unlike, let's say the Putin-Trump meeting in Anchorage, they wanted to solve the Ukraine problem quite quickly. In this case, both sides are taking a very sensible approach that whatever we announce, we need to make sure it lasts a certain amount of time. So I'm not just looking at what potentially happens at APEC this year. President Trump has been promised has promised that he'll be invited to China next year for a state visit. Next year, the United States hosts the G20. President Xi should attend that. Next year, China hosts APEC. President Trump should attend that. So if you look at that list of things, I think what we need to see is how enduring the issues are in terms of striking a deal. And there are many difficult issues. We are talking about trade issues, but there are issues around fentanyl, which are quite challenging to deal with. The first Trump administration and the Biden administration also tried to deal with these issues. So there has to be a considerable number of caution as we look at what comes out with it, not just take the immediate headline, but really look what's going to last over the course of the Trump administration.
You mentioned about, having to see what can actually endure and enduring agreement. So can you maybe share with us, putting aside APEC then, specifically on trade, what are the areas you think for US and China there can possibly be some progress in terms of agreements for trade? And also conversely, of course, what are the sticking points, that's entrenched in there that's possibly going to stay as a stalemate?
Well, the US-China relationship is one that we see of competition, but you also see great interrelationships between the two. The two countries have become very dependent on each other in economic terms. China has suddenly unveiled the rare earth elements, and the United States realizes they need rare earth elements. The United States has put tariffs. That's a significant amount of leverage that's impacting Chinese companies. Both sides have areas in which they have pain points and where they feel that they want to have some sort of agreement between the two. So the trade and tariffs, I think President Trump has used tariffs as part of a very significant form of leverage. The Chinese have their levels of leverage as well. So in this case, they both seem sort of balanced to try and work something out. It's quite unlike, again, other countries where the US has used leverage and the other country has not been able to respond. The EU is an example where their response has not been able to match the US leverage. Canada is another example. In the US-China relationship, given the nature of their sort of interdependence in many ways, the nature of their two very large economies, they are going to be driving in the global changes into the future. And I think that there's a sense of responsibility on both sides that we can't blow up the system. I know we're very concerned about all these shifts taking place, but I think both sides want to make sure that there is a certain system because each one has domestic issues to deal with, even while dealing with these international issues.
I will want to go to Ms. Cutler, with your experience in actually being on the negotiating table with so many different countries. With your experience, do you think what are the areas that US and China can actually progress on in terms of trade negotiation? And again, where are the challenges?
So I think my view is a bit different because my view is we should have modest expectations for what can be achieved in the coming few years with China. I think, though, that both sides are committed to seek some kind of stabilization in the relationship. But I also think that both sides are realistic, particularly the US. We're not going to change the Chinese system. I think during Trump 1.0, during the phase one agreement, there was more optimism that we could sit down and conclude a 50-page trade agreement, and this would result in significant changes in the relationship, and that did not happen. I was struck by a recent speech given by USTR Jameson Greer just last week, and he said the 55% tariff was about right, and that should be kind of the status quo. So I'm very skeptical of the US embracing the Chinese request to somehow eliminate or reduce tariffs, particularly for Chinese companies investing in the US, because if Washington were to do that, they would also have to eliminate those tariffs for US companies as well as for suppliers from other countries as well. That said, investment seeking, inviting more foreign direct investment from China seems to be on the table, and maybe there's modest progress we can make. But I think we need to be realistic. I think we need to focus on non-strategic sectors and see how we can build trust and implement kind of these confidence building measures between the two countries, which will contribute towards stabilization.
What will be some of these non-strategic sectors that we can possibly look at?
And that's a challenge. And I know at times between the U.S. and Chinese negotiators, that we've sat down and we've tried to come up with those lists.
Everything is strategic.
Well, not everything, but you can look at, there are definitely some more consumer type products, agriculture type products, low tech products that could fall into that basket. But again, I don't know if that's the right approach, is trying to come up with that list, because I think that could take forever and you'll never then negotiate any outcomes. But again, I think it's those kind of low-hanging fruit, confidence-building measures that can help us move forward with China, but also not to lead to, a situation where either side has just has huge expectations that are unmet, and that leads to a lot of disdain and adversarial relations between the two countries. And I do think that the Chinese team and the US team right now seem to be committed to that. They want to have a successful meeting in APEC. The president's talking about visiting China early next year. He's invited Xi Jinping to the United States. And I think what Ambassador Mapori said is important as well, because next year, with the US chairing the G20 and China hosting APEC, there are going to be so many opportunities, not just for the leaders to get together, but for the ministers from both countries, whether it be the finance ministers or the trade ministers or the commerce ministers or the energy ministers. And I think all of that engagement is positive and could help contribute to a stabilization in our bilateral relationship.
Going to Professor Wu, I would like to ask, Ms. Cutler was saying that it might be quite challenging to try to reduce the tariff by 20%. But from the Chinese perspective, what can the Chinese possibly offer on the negotiating table? What are the cards that you can play to persuade the Americans to actually lower this tariff?
Well, before addressing that specific question, I want to call your attention to the somewhat changing dynamics for China-US relations as compared with the first Trump administration. I think there are three aspects that we should pay attention to. One is the mode of engagement. From early this year, coercion by imposing unilateral tariff, and then confrontation between two sides through tariff war, now gradually moved to talks and trade-off. So that is a shifting mode of engagement we have seen in the last several months. The second change is that after two leaders' recent phone call, basically they have an idea about what the two leaders will try to achieve through what we call the summit diplomacy. U.S.-China relations, like many other relations between two countries, are sometimes agenda-driven, as Ashok just mentioned. Now, this year's APEC is the opportunity for two leaders to meet. Then the next year, exchange of visits, and the G20 APEC So every time when two leaders are supposed to meet, they want to deliver something on the bilateral agenda. And also, when they just mentioned, building confidence. When recently the U.S. side told the Chinese side that they do not want to change China's system. Okay, in the first Trump administration in the later years, basically regime change was the goal of U.S.-China policy. But this time, when they say they have no intention to change China's system, we kind of believe that because Trump is more now he's more interested in changing U.S. system, so that's his priority. So getting back to your specific question, as I mentioned, President Xi mentioned three things: tariff, TikTok, and Chinese investment in the U.S. So if the U.S. is going to further reduce or even remove the unilateral tariff on China, I think China may agree to increase the purchase of U.S. products, from Boeing aircraft to agricultural products. I think some negotiation over this purchase is already going on between two sides. And also, Trump is someone who like to see more foreign direct investment in the U.S. He has already tried to secure commitment from Europe, from Japan, from South Korea to invest in the U.S. I guess he's also interested in getting the Chinese investment in the U.S. manufacturing sector. So in that case, I think China is prepared to move along the line. And actually, in the recent negotiation held in Madrid, China has come up with a very ambitious proposal about how we should address bilateral trade and economic relations in which trade, investment, technology, and finance are actually correlated. So let's not just focus on trade imbalance as one separate issue. It should be put in the broader context of bilateral economic relations. Now, I think the ball is in the U.S. court to say whether President Trump and his team is serious about making a good deal with China and to address some of the U.S. concerns while also addressing the Chinese concern in this very dynamic process.
So, Professor Wu, you were saying that, we were moving from coercion to confrontation, now finally talks. So it has been a very turbulent year for everybody.
Yes.
Yeah. So, for the rest of the world, can we expect a more stable and predictable environment after the APEC meeting, after the talks has been done?
Well, the world will remain to be turbulent in many ways, even though, Singapore, as I trust, will remain to be a place of prosperity and security as we can always expect. I think if we can make progress in bilateral economic relations, that may help get President Trump to realize the limit of his tariff card, as a leverage, not only against China, but also against other countries, including the U.S. allies. Actually, if the inflation rate continues to hike in the U.S. and begin to hurt the U.S. economy, I think that's going to be politically challenging for GOP and for President Trump as the midterm election next year is approaching. So I don't know whether this will get him to rethink about the limited use of tariff as a leverage. I mean, he still claims to be a tariff man, but to some extent, he may also learn something from this episode. So if China and the US, the two largest world economies, can gradually reduce the friction, reduce confrontation, stabilize bilateral relations, and begin to approach the economic relations in a more win-win rather than zero-sum turn, I think that's certainly a positive signal to the market throughout the world. So in that sense, I think we are not just working on bilateral issues. Actually, we are working trying to stabilize the entire world economy. Especially next year, U.S. is going to host the G20 summit, right? U.S. needs to show it's a responsible host for this very important world economic mechanism. And in this process, stabilizing economic relations with China as well as with other major trading partners, I think it should be a priority for President Trump in his second year. Yeah.
I see Miss Cutler shaking her head, so please bring on the bad news for us.
I mean, just to respond, I think one observation I would make when I look at Trump 1.0 and what's going on now, I think China's way more prepared and learned a lot of lessons from the Phase One agreement. And China has reduced its dependence on the United States. It's importing less from the United States as a proportion and more from the rest of the world. It also has put into place a lot of new laws and regulations allowing it to counter respond to US measures. And you look at China's also identified its leverage points, critical minerals, magnets, and now soybeans, and it's using the threat of those exports and purchases as leverage over the United States. And also, I just, when you look at the Phase One deal, it was largely China making concessions and the US kind of, succeeding in getting China to respond to most of its requests. Now it's a very different China. And it just seems to me, and I was caught by something you said, because you suggested a trade-off between soybean purchases and lower tariffs. And I think this is the approach China is taking against the U.S. right now. That for everything the U.S. wants, it wants the U.S. also to pay. And I think again that makes it much more difficult to find solutions. And that's why again I'm advocating or just saying that I think the more realistic approach is to have realistic expectations, build confidence, and over time take steps, to improve and to stabilize the relations. Now, I will admit, this is something that our president doesn't see when you talk about incremental steps or you talk about progress. He wants the big bang. And so I think China's been very skillful in putting on the table, a big number with respect to prospects for Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States. I think the president himself is probably more open to that than many of his advisors and many folks in Congress. And so we'll have to see how that plays out over time.
So can Mr. Mirpuri maybe give us an assessment on, how the rest of the world is facing this turbulence? And moving forward, do we actually foresee like major realignment of the businesses and investments? Or do you think the investments are still going to take a wait and see approach for now?
Well, first, make no mistake, even if we see some moderate optimism in what President Trump and President Xi may come up with when they meet at APEC, there are still significant elements of instability in the relationship. We can talk about trade, we've gone through that. There are security challenges. There's the issue of Taiwan. There's every day, as planes and ships patrol across the South China Sea, you have significant risk of miscalculation that could just end up into a conflict. Now, there are not enough layers of conversation at that part. Secretary Pete Hegseth has spoken to his Chinese counterpart, but we have not really seen the military-to-military engagement that is important to avoid some of these miscalculations that might emerge. So I don't want to paint an overly optimistic picture around just trade, because this is a dramatic global competition between two great powers, and neither side wants to give up its position. And that is really that challenge, because as the United States now sees itself dealing with an almost peer competitor, they're not going to give way. They will use every leverage that they have, economic, political, security, including their partners and allies, to get them aligned on their side. And China, for its part, as it emerges as a great power, would also want to use all elements available to it, including its partners around the world, its economic ties around the world. So I think we are in a time of very significant global competition between the two. These are the global shifts that the minister was speaking about in the earlier session. And the rest of us really need to start adjusting to that. There's going to be a new map of globalization. I think that we're not going to sort of look back and say, it was sort of a significant period in which the US led, China benefited, all of us benefit from that. That world has changed. There's going to be a new map. It doesn't necessarily have to be an unstable map, but there will be new elements in this new map of globalization, new ties that have to be built. Countries have to organize themselves around their relationships with the United States and China. The way that the minister framed for Singapore his slide about Singapore's relationships both with the US and China. Many countries will have to take stock where they are, how they need to make adjustments. But what's becoming quite interesting is you're starting to see new elements emerge. Countries are now starting to speak with each other, even as they deal with the United States and China. There's more interest in building up trade and economic links with other partners. For a long time, because we were so focused on the two great powers, sometimes we just let them lead the trade conversation. Now I think there are new opportunities. Singapore itself launched last month something called the FITP, Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, with several 12 or 14 smaller countries. These are the new areas I think we need to start looking at. The other thing we need to start thinking about, what is the new role of middle powers? Because where does Indonesia fit in this? Where does Turkey fit in this? Where does Brazil fit in? These are new adjustments that need to be made as we look. I mean, the term that people use is the global south. I'm not sure if that fully clarifies where we are going, but we've got to start thinking of some of these new issues as we talk about US-China relations. It's no longer about just the two of them. It's how the rest of us react in these new challenges and these new shifts.
Now, so on global governance, now there has been considerable debate on the erosion of the so-called rules-based order as we know it. Now, many observers have criticized the US for undermining this global order, and what we see is China is increasingly positioning itself to fill this gap and have come up with very grand proposals like the Global Governance Initiative. So what role do you guys see China play in reshaping these global norms, leading the international institutions? And do you think we will actually see a significant reordering of the global leadership? If Ms. Cutler can start.
Look, I think the current global order, the global governance order, has serious gaps and serious problems. And many of the institutions we've relied on for many years, the rules haven't been updated to reflect the changes in the world. With respect to trade, this means the World Trade Organization. And while many people, are accusing the United States of undermining the World Trade Organization, in fact, I would argue that this has been kind of a joint effort among many countries, including China, including India and others. But I will also say the US has had its share of its responsibility as well. But the challenge is that no one has been able to kind of figure out how to improve those rules, how to negotiate new agreements that address the new issues. And as a result, these institutions like the WTO are kind of being sidelined as countries look for other opportunities to work with others. As Ambassador Murpuri just mentioned, there's a huge effort underway in Asia, all around the world, to kind of look for new types of arrangements between countries. I personally don't see, I've looked at the new global governance initiative that China just announced, and I look forward to the professor's description of it. But from my point of view, it's a lot of words and not a lot of details. And so you can talk about inclusiveness, you can talk about resiliency, you can talk about shared responsibility. But the question is, how do you take these principles in today's world and actually operationalize them? And that requires, a country or countries who are really committed to the system and less interested in their own national interests. And I think Those countries are they're not around these days. In many respects, I look like to a Singapore and to some of these middle-sized countries as the ones who are going to have to take the initiative here, because the global powers, particularly the U.S. and China, I think we're both less interested in a rules-based approach and more interested kind of in a power-based.
Well, I think first and foremost, China realizes that it's a time that U.S. is no longer waiting to take the lead. So some countries, China included, have to stand up, not only for its own national interests, but for the interests of, broader international community. Um, First and foremost, I think China tries to be a more um, forward-looking initiator. We come up with all kinds of proposals about how to deal with the current problems with global governance, and including the very recent global governance initiative. So I think these ideas are very important when people say that both globalization and global governance have been stalled in recent years. And the second thing China is doing, I think, is also to be an active actor. You don't just, come up with proposals. You need, to translate into actions. For example, when the U.S. under Donald Trump decided to withdraw from World Health Organization, then someone has to, increase the resources to support this very important multilateral institution, and China did it. And also recently, China suggested it will not seek any special and differentiation treatment in the current and future negotiations with the WTO. I think which is very important, because otherwise that will cause a lot of controversy within this multilateral institutions. And also in terms of climate change, environmental improvement assistance to the developing countries to help them secure 2030 development agenda goal. I mean, China has been doing a lot, not quite to replace the place of the U.S., but rather how to fill the gap between, the demand and the supply in the world today. And last but not least is that I think China is also interested in creating this kind of coalition for willing in pursuing global governance. BRICS may be one platform, and there can be also other platforms that other countries, stakeholders, if they wish, they can join. I mean, your minister just mentioned that Singapore doesn't want to choose sides between China and US. But you don't take sides between countries. Doesn't mean you do not have positions on major issues. When we are confronted with the tension between multilateralism and unilateralism, between protectionism, trade protectionism, and the force for open and free international economy, you got to take a position, and you need to show your seriousness in pushing the common goal. So I think in that sense, to some extent, this is also a great opportunity for China to show that it's not only a rising power, but also a responsible major power to work for its own benefits, but also to work for the benefits of us all. Yeah.
Mr. Mianpuri, how do you think other countries, Singapore, middle power countries, how are we going to respond to all this?
I think we're not going to replicate the unipolar moment where the United States was overly dominant, particularly after the end of the Cold War. Many of the elements of global order that we're familiar with came out of the Second World War institutions, and then obviously the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and then what emerged is the US as really number one. I think countries no longer want to necessarily operate under one single unipolar power. What you may find is a lot more issue-based institutions that come into play. And countries will sort of operate upon different issues on different things. And countries will sort of operate upon different issues on different things. It's interesting that when President Trump spoke at the UN 2 weeks ago, he laid out issues of how the U.S. looks at the UN, and we've always seen the UN as potentially a global government. It has not played that role. In fact, it's gotten weaker and weaker with the veto that the permanent members of the Security Council have. President Trump spoke about sovereignty. He spoke about peace. He spoke about homeland security. I think no member in that room in the UN General Assembly would object to that. Everyone wants sovereignty, peace, homeland security. These are big issues. Now, can that replicate a global system? There will be issues that we will need some sense of rules, and particularly for small countries, you need a rules-based system. Wendy mentioned the WTO. That's very critical. We've seen globalization build on that. There are rules around the International Court of Justice, which also are quite important. Where they are, I think what the challenge we're going to feel is the gaps in new areas where we haven't quite worked out institutions to look at these. Take AI. Every day we're talking about AI. I think there's no clear idea what is the AI rules and who's going to draft these rules. Is it the two AI champions, the US and China, each leading in their own way? Do smaller countries work around that? Again, how do you work out ethics of AIs? What are the rules that we deal with these things? These are some of the more challenging issues that we haven't quite sorted out. The other area that's become very complicated is where there is conflict. And without any sort of ability to deal with these conflicts, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Israel-Hamas war, each one of the things, sometimes you do need a great power to try and work these things out. So there are gaps that have started to emerge. The current system is not completely functioning, and smaller countries want to find a way in which we can work some of these things out among ourselves, necessary, but also being able to make sure that the rules endure.
Thank you very much. I will move to the questions. And actually, there are some questions that's quite related to what Mr. Mirpuri has said earlier. So I'll pitch the first question to you. What's your view on this multipolar versus unipolar world? Which one is better for the world, in particular as the US turns inwards? And also, can you also maybe give us an assessment of what you think the current US administration, the direction that they are bringing us, is this going to continue? Or is there a chance of change when a new administration comes in?
I don't like binary options, multipolar versus unipolar. The world is changing, and we just have to keep adjusting to it. Again, even if you look at the past 80 years since the Second World War, there have been very significant changes in the global system. We just took it for granted as these changes took place. New institutions emerge. We use some of these new institutions. Some institutions disappeared. And you sort of have to deal with some of these new challenges. I think the reality is that with these global shifts, countries have to find a new balance in which they can avoid conflict and focus on the prosperity and the economic development of their people. Now, each country needs to find its own way in that. The rules, in many ways, the rules of trade have changed. The rules of economic security have changed. We never thought that every country would be dealing with industrial policy. China has industrial policy. The United States has industrial policy. Each is very concerned with that. COVID showed how resilience, domestic resilience, becomes very important for all of us as we deal with the COVID challenges. So I think that there are changes taking place. I think each country needs to find some sort of balance. We hope that the larger countries, the great powers, countries, regional countries like Europe, we haven't spoken much about India today, will also be able to play a role in which a sort of stable system, as the system adjusts, and we can sort of deal with each one of these challenges that emerge, and without saying I prefer one or the other, because we really don't have a choice. On the second question, Wendy maybe have a better answer than me, but really, I think that we have to take the United States. I lived for 11 years as ambassador in Washington. Even then, in those more than a decade, you start to see changes in the way the United States wants to deal with the world. And it's not a matter of party that is in office. Each party has now decided that the US needs to focus domestically. When the Biden administration came in after the first Trump administration, they essentially followed through on many of the practices that the Trump administration put in place. On China, the China tariffs were not lifted when the Biden administration came in. And I don't think that you will see very significant changes if there is a when there is a new administration in the United States, if it comes from the other party. Because there are many things that the present Trump administration are doing are actually good for the United States. Deregulation is good. Government's gotten too big, and deregulation is some of the issues that the country has to deal with. The fact that they have lost some of their economic verve is also quite important that President Trump is trying to bring it back. The United States, for all the criticism we make of it, is still the driver of global innovation. That's where the AI challenge is coming from. So you still see a country, but there are changes that need to be done, both in terms of their foreign policy and economic policy, some of which I think will endure through every administration as you go ahead. So we should not expect very dramatic swings left or right as administrations change. In fact, that's the most confusing for all of us. We want more consistency, we want more predictability, and if we take the positions that the US take as particularly long term, that at least go 3, 5, 10 years, that makes it a lot easier for us to deal with that.
You know, it's interesting because there's a lot of people look at the policies of President Trump as he started all of this, or this was his idea. But a lot of these frustrations were really building up in the United States over a number of years. Now, he's responded to these frustrations in a very forceful and in somewhat a very, destabilizing way. And in some ways, the people in America feel very divided now. We've seen, our Congress, which used to have such a huge role in the development of U.S. policy, seems to be on the sidelines. Republicans, who used to be the party that was championing free trade and global participation, is now becoming more isolationist. So there are a lot of changes going on. But when I, look ahead, I think that in 3.5 years, when a new administration comes in, whether in the Republican or Democratic Party, we'll see further changes. But I would hope that we move more towards the center, that what we're seeing now is kind of radical. But over time, I'm hoping that the U.S. will come back in some degree. But for those folks who want the U.S. to come back and to be the leader again in the global, order, I don't see that happening. And I think that, a lot of people had expectations for Biden when he came into office that things would just get back to normal. And as Ambassador Mapuri said, no, there were things that he changed. But one of the important things that he changed in U.S. policy was working with allies and partners, and working with them working with them to address global challenges and emerging issues. And that's an area that I'm personally very troubled by, because that's what I spent so much of my career in the trade world trying to do. And when I look now at what we're doing on trade, even if we were to reach some kind of agreement with China, we're still taking on the rest of the world. I mean, many countries are not happy with us. They have high tariffs. They're being asked to make enormous purchases, make investments. What we're asking Japan and Korea to do now in terms of coming forward with hundreds of billions of dollars for an investment fund, a lot of this just seems to be really pushing the edge for a lot of our trading partners. So I would hope we're not going to go back to where we were, but I hope that we can move more towards the middle in the coming years.
Thank you. I've got one question here specifically for Professor Wu. So would you agree that China has a longer stamina to negotiate with the US in view of China's political stability and continuity in trade engagement with the rest of the world?
I think when China deal with Trump 2.0, we realize we need to make adjustments both strategically and tactically. Wendy just shared with some of her observation about the changing Chinese approach. to
Is
this.
that right?
Quite insightful. Okay. Um, I mean, learning by doing, right? So China is prepared for Trump's comeback, and we reflected on our dealing with him in his first term, and we, discussed about what would be the best approach to deal with him in his second term. And so far, I would say this seems to be working pretty well. Okay, and that's part of the reason why I feel more optimistic than these two panelists about the forthcoming meeting between two leaders. Having said that, we understand that we are not just dealing Trump as the president of one administration. We are dealing with the U.S. as a country that is, witnessing some fundamental changes. And to some extent, internally, the U.S. is so divided and polarized. And externally, I think the U.S. just feels tired and exhausted, having behaved as a kind of, unipolar hegemon in the last 3 decades. I think people in the U.S., they began to change their mind. So they don't say that is the role they want to play in the world. So I think China has to think about our U.S. policy in that broad context. And same as Ashok just mentioned, I think, unipolarity, multipolarity, the entire world, we have to get used to the changing reality. So that is the way, maybe the last time when this happened was the end of Cold War, 30, 34, 5 years ago. And before that was the end of World War II. So every several decades, we see a big shift in international political, strategic, and economic landscape. So I think when China deals with Trump, of course, we look at the specific issues of concern, but we also put this in a broader context. So this is why, as I just mentioned, China wants to be a more constructive initiator, more active actor on the world stage in a time when both globalization and global governance suffers from stagnation. And in this regard, I think we are going to say, to some extent, this may be the first time since the end of World War II, non-Western countries are really taking lead on some of the most important international agenda for the first time. And so not just China, but maybe Southeast Asia, India, Japan to some extent, and BRICS countries, they will join hands in pushing, the common agenda in a time when the U.S. is less and less willing to play the role of the leadership. And life has to continue, right? In a post-U.S. hegemonic world. I think that's a great picture. In China, we think about, dealing with Trump in this, turbulent era. Yeah.
A few of you have mentioned India, so I have a question on India here. Aside from China or the US, does India actually stand a chance in rising as an equal opponent? If yes, is there an expectation or a timeline of how this would change the global landscape? Will Mr. Mirpuri like to start first?
I was waiting to see who you point the finger to take on the India question. India is a large country with a significant amount of opportunity to move forward on the global stage. Unfortunately, India has not quite played that role as effectively. Because of their own domestic economic challenges, they're very focused on getting things right at home. And that's taking far longer than many of us expected they might be able to do. This year, they started the year with the Trump administration very well. Prime Minister Modi had meetings with President Trump. They were hoping to get a trade deal. This got derailed a couple of months ago. And I think that sort of made their ability to get on this economic uh, trajectory that they need to do, which is not just bringing investments in, but also getting regulatory changes to take place, technocratic changes to take place. But they will play a very significant role globally. They have not really engaged actively in things like the WTO. In fact, in many ways, they have held back some of the WTO conversations because they have agriculture and a very large economy. So I think that we should encourage them to play that bigger role, particularly in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, where we do have China as an active member of the region. We benefit from that. We have the United States as an active member of the region. Having India as a third leg in that would actually help create better balance in our region. But I'm not sure how much longer it will take. Obviously, they go through these periodic periods when it's two steps forward, one step back. And I think that's really some of the challenges looking at India that I think we have to anticipate.
If I can add, I think something I'm watching really closely is the EU-India free trade agreement negotiations, which apparently have been going on for like 20 years. And now they've set a deadline for the end of this year. And there seems to be a real interest on both sides in concluding such a deal. And other countries have been concluding trade deals with India. And we'll have to see if that trend continues. But I couldn't agree more. I think that India is moving in the right direction. It's just moving slowly. And, again, I love what you just said, two steps forward, one step back, because that's kind of the US experience with India. We got very close to a trade agreement with them just a few months ago. And then, they couldn't cross the finish line. And so our negotiators are back at the table. Maybe they'll be able to strike a deal and that could get our relations with India, somewhat back on track. But I think it's going to be very important to watch India, particularly in this world where, a lot of the give-ins and the norms are just kind of all up in the air and we don't know where things are going to fall these days.
So no question can
Can I
go
also
without.
jump related
please.
to not particularly to India, but I mean to your earlier question about global governance. Without the U.S., the active U.S. participation and leadership, it is indeed very difficult to pursue some important global agenda at the moment. And as a result of that, I think countries in this region and beyond are actually trying to explore the alternative approaches, including forging, bilateral, multilateral, and even regional agreements on trade and investment. So maybe we are going to be less ambitious down the road about how we can promote trade and investment liberalization as we used to, working in a multilateral global context. Now we have to think more and more in terms of bilateral, regional, and multilateralist framework. So that's my take.
Being mindful of time, I will ask one last question. So looking forward, further ahead, maybe 5 to 10 years down the road. So I just need 2 lines, okay? Because we are standing in between us and lunch, So 2 lines from each of you. What is the most likely trajectory for US-China relations and by extension for the global order? And is there less likely but still plausible wildcard scenario where all of us should be worried about?
I think that particularly, I speak coming from a small country, you have to be prepared for all eventualities. You want the world to be better, but you never know what's going to make it worse. None of us anticipated, just in the past 5 years, pandemics, wars, conflicts, and we were fortunate. The pandemic obviously struck all of us around the world, but the wars, in a way, were in Europe and in the Middle East, but we were not insulated from them. We all had to make choices in these wars of how you're going to respond to this. Singapore's position in the Russian invasion of Ukraine was to go and reinforce international rules-based order. So you do need rules. Now, if I'm looking ahead, if we can build systems of rules that actually give us space to operate in, then it's good for small countries and it's not bad for big countries as well. I know big countries want to be completely on their own and sort of muscle their way through, but actually having systems that work is a point of some optimism. Now, if the US-China relationship can give us better rules to deal with some of the global challenges, future pandemic, obviously climate change, technological changes, I think that will be useful and helpful for us. And on the other hand, you never give up your preparation of in case things go wrong. And then meanwhile, you build up relationships with other people that give you a little bit more ballast as you look ahead.
Just one line. What is the trajectory for US-China relations in the next 5 to 10 years?
I'm generally optimistic.
That's good.
In our world, we just always have to be optimistic. Yes, you can always have conflict, but I think both sides understand the risk of a very significant conflict between them will be, terrible for all of us. You may have proxy conflicts like you had during the Cold War, but not necessarily US-China conflict directly.
Professor Wu?
Well, I think China-US relations will remain to be tense and turbulent, to be sure. When a declining hegemon, which is becoming more and more, suspicious about itself and also about a rising major rivalry, I can understand this logic behind the U.S. Policy towards China. So I think the U.S. would continue to do whatever it takes to try to contain and suppress China. So that's the negative side. And on that trajectory, we'll continue to see tension, turbulence, and crisis. And even at some point, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of a conflict between two countries at the Taiwan issue, which is so important to China. But on the other hand, by and large, I think 5 to 10 years from now, the U.S. may begin to rethink about its China policy as it is today. That is, as China becomes stronger with more progress in technology area, the U.S. may begin to realize the limit of its current policy towards China, whether this policy works or not. And secondly, I think the U.S. may also realize gradually that it needs to cooperate with China on many issues. I mean, even Donald Trump began to realize it has to rely on Chinese, not just rare earth, but our purchase of U.S. products, our investment. So cooperation may become more salient in U.S. policy consideration about the relation with China. And thirdly, as I mentioned, this relationship will go through some crises, even some conflicts. That will caution Washington that they need to work with China to put in place some important mechanisms in terms of crisis management, crisis avoidance, communication, and also confidence building measures, as Wendy just mentioned, in both strategic and non-strategic areas. So overall, I think 5 years from now, as China becomes stronger and making more progress in technological areas and increasing its international influence, that may help get the U.S.-China policy more realistic, more pragmatic. So that would help stabilize this relationship. Again, I'm quite optimistic.
But is there any wild-card scenarios that you think will actually derail this?
The only scenario that this will derail this relationship is Taiwan, as I can see. That's a major issue. Yeah. I still cannot rule out this possibility at the moment.
So when I look at U.S.-China relations, looking forward, I just think it's going to be a rocky road. There'll be some ups and there are going to be some downs. But I think what's critical, and the professor, you alluded to this, is keeping the channels of communication open. And when those channels have been closed, that's when the world gets the most nervous about kind of just, walking into a conflict. And so I would hope that we can establish those channels that we can keep open regardless of the ups or the downs, in order to avoid conflicts, which are not just going to affect China and the US, they're going to affect not only Asia, but the whole world. And, it's important that we avoid going in that direction. Some crazy scenario. I just wonder, when I look at the US sometimes, I think in some ways, and I'm just talking from an economic point of view, we're kind of becoming a little more like China, right? Our government's getting a little more active in our economic policy in terms of buying stakes in companies now, or trying to get the profits from when we give them export licenses, et cetera. And I just wonder if maybe over time, China's going to kind of move more in our direction and recognize that market opening and reform, which was kind of the cry as China got closer to looking seriously at WTO accession. So I wonder if we move in China's direction a little, and China moves in our direction, maybe that's a scenario 10 years from now we may see. That's about as optimistic as I can get.
We learn from each other only on the positive side, I hope.
So the world is very messy as of now. So I do hope your cautious optimism will prevail. Now, thank you once again, Ms. Cutler, Professor Wu, and Mr. Mirpuri for unpacking all these layers with us. Please join me in thanking our three panelists.